Thank you, John. I also want to let everyone know that I am the Asia Foundation's country representative, but a member of the executive committee of the Vietnam Business Forum's Power and Energy Working Group. And together with John and other members of the VBF, worked on the Made in Vietnam Energy Plan. But today I want to talk to you about a particular project that I worked on with the Asia Foundation. And this project in Da Nang was very important for us, not because it was a great success in reducing carbon emissions, because it taught us a lot about working with the private sector. Somebody show me how to use this. Press the big green one. And do I need to point to that somewhere? Not the other green one. Okay, and how do I go back? The red one. Okay, sorry everyone. So we'll start with a little bit of a project overview. This project was carried out between 2013 and 2015, and it was funded by the UK's Prosperity Fund. And why did we start this project? Well, as John mentioned, Vietnam has a very, very high energy intensity rate. From 1985 to 2014, Vietnam's energy intensity increased from 0.18 to 0.9 kilowatt hours per US dollar of GDP. What that means is it takes 90 kilowatt hours of energy to produce $1 in revenue. And this was led primarily by the manufacturing sector, which increased from 0.4 kilowatt hours per US dollar in GDP to 1.3 kilowatt hours of energy per US dollar of GDP. There's been a lot of research on the reasons why this has happened. And to be fair and honest, that trend has been coming down a bit. It's not as high as it was in 2014, but it is still, as John said, higher than every other country in ASEAN. And even if we meet the target for 2030 in energy intensity, Vietnam will still be the most energy intensive country in Southeast Asia. This has a big implication for Vietnam's competitiveness because energy is one component of productivity. At the same time, it will increasingly have an impact on Vietnam's trade relations. And why is that? As many of you know, in December, the European Union has agreed on something they call the Green Deal. And Europe wants to take charge of leadership on reduction of climate emissions. And one way that they will do this is through something called a climate border adjustment tax. And that climate border adjustment tax will tax the embodied carbon in imports into the EU. And one way of calculating whether a country meets a certain standard or not will be through its energy intensity. So why does Vietnam have such a high energy intensity? Dr. Phu and Dr. Hien of the Atomic Energy Institute in Vietnam and Dr. Phu at the Fulbright University in Ho Chi Minh City have both pointed out that low electricity tariffs for the manufacturing sector are the primary reason for Vietnam's high energy intensity. And why is this? It's because the low tariffs for the manufacturing sector, which were created in order to encourage the growth in manufacturing, also have a negative effect because they encourage manufacturers to use more energy rather than invest in energy efficient processes and process technology. So you can imagine There are many small and medium enterprises in Vietnam that buy used equipment for manufacturing. It may not be energy efficient, but what does it matter if the cost of energy is only a small part of their production costs? This project, again funded by the UK's Prosperity Fund, was intended to encourage businesses to reduce their energy use and in that way reduce emissions by certain interventions that could reduce their cost and increase their competitiveness. So let me tell you a little bit about the project location and impact. We chose to work in two industrial zones in Da Nang City, LIN Chiu and Thợ industrial zones, and you can see they're on opposite sides of Da Nang Bay. In fact, in the second year of the project, the Da Nang People's Committee asked us to also work in a third industrial zone that produced seafood. Altogether, we had about 150 businesses that were involved in project activities. The low-carbon industrial zone model that we developed for this project and the action plan that we did together with Da Nang Dan Rê was the first of its kind in Vietnam. Our friends at UNIDO have followed with what they call the Eco Industrial Zone Program, which is larger in scope and covers more of the country. But this was actually the first model for doing this. By the end of the second year of this project, CO2 emissions from these three industrial zones was reduced by about 2,250 tons. And this was despite the increase in electricity consumption. Not because the businesses were using more electricity, but because there were more businesses in the industrial zones. So as the industrial zones expanded, we were still able to reduce the amount of carbon emissions. How did we go about this project? We started with a baseline assessment of carbon footprint of these two industrial zones. And that was conducted by the Industrial Policy and Strategy Institute of the Ministry of Industry and Trade. And that assessment was a lot like what you just saw from our friends at the U.S. Green Building Council about assessing the energy uses. So waste, water, electricity use, and other factors were included in that. That baseline study was then reported to businesses in these industrial zones. And we did that through workshops at the industrial zones, and then by individual conversations with some of the big energy users. At the third stage, we recruited some core businesses to join the effort. And the core businesses, they had to have some kind of manufacturing process in which we could make an intervention. At the end of 2 years, I think we had only 10 businesses that were still a part of that and doing something. The Da Nang Dan Rê created an online management system to monitor progress in the program. This, I think, was the most important innovation, where businesses reported online energy use, waste, types of fuels and use of fuels every month to the Da Nang Dan Rê on an online application. And also, Dan Rê was able to collect the electricity metering data in each of these industrial zones every month, because as most of you know, in industrial zones, the management authority also is the manager of electricity supply. So they resell the electricity and have an understanding of both the individual use of electricity from each of the businesses in the industrial zone, and the overall use of electricity. Observations, and this is one of the key slides in this presentation. I put an image from one of the businesses that was part of our core group here, and that is a company in Da Nang that produces sanitary ware. Sanitary ware is basically toilets and sinks and things like that, made out of porcelain. As you can imagine, they use a lot of electricity to kiln, fire the porcelain. And they have a lot of waste heat from that system. What this company did, now you have to understand the process, okay? So first they have to mold the sinks and the toilets. Then they have to let them dry. And once they are dry, then they can put them in a kiln to fire them. But because of the external weather conditions, it may take 1, 2, or even 3 days to dry a toilet or a sink if it's just left out in an open warehouse. So what this company did is they built essentially a room about this size, the size of this room, made out of brick and stone. And then they take the waste heat from the kiln and run it through pipes in the walls and the floor of that room. Why did they do that? Well, now they got a nice warm room where they can take their wet, recently molded sinks and toilets and put them in there during the daytime because they've collected all the heat overnight when the kiln is being used. So the kiln fires at night, and then the waste heat from the kiln goes into the big stone and brick room, then where they are also drying the toilets and sink. By this way, they can always ensure that they have a supply of dry toilets and sinks to go into the kiln every night. All right, so they just cycle it through constantly. And this allowed them to produce more efficiently, to produce more regularly an amount. They produced about 1,400 toilets and sinks per day on average. But it also was a cost savings for them, because if they can fire every night and if they can dry every day, they don't need as large a warehouse space on the floor for drying their products. There were other companies that were working with us, including some seafood companies that were using coal in their boilers, and they transitioned from the use of coal to the use of rice husk, châu, from the rice as a fuel, which also is a carbon neutral because it's something that's grown and then burned rather than something that's dug up out of the ground and burned. So what did we learn from this project? The first thing I want to mention is that none of the businesses that we worked with were motivated by targets and plans. By targets and plans, I mean, Da Nang City may have a target of reducing carbon emissions. The UN and Vietnam have their Paris commitments. These do not motivate businesses. These are just nice ideas for businesses. Rather, businesses are motivated by their competitiveness and profitability. So one of the key things we learned from this project is if you're going to work with businesses on the reduction of carbon emissions through energy efficiency, you need to focus on the core business activities. And that means you need to start with a business process assessment to figure out where the use of energy occurs, and then you need to do a financial assessment to see where the costs are accruing. The second thing we saw is that most businesses will regard the energy intensity of their industrial zone as, I say, interesting information. Interesting information is, oh, I didn't know that. But there's really nothing you can do about that because it's a collective, it's an industrial zone. Or they may be interested, oh, Vietnam has a high energy intensity. Well, that's interesting information. What can I do about it? They can't do much about it. But what they can do is work on their own energy intensity, because as compared to their competitors, this is also a key metric for the company, right? If energy is a component of your cost, energy intensity is one key metric for your company. And reducing your energy intensity, if your competitors do not, is also a competitive advantage. So the second point that we learned is to focus on core business metrics, or what some people call KPIs. So the third thing is, so there are many reasons why a company may invest in energy savings and process equipment that are completely outside the company's balance sheet, which means it's not related to their finance or core business activities. And what are those kinds of things? The first, supply chain leadership. They may be part of a supply chain that requires them, because of environment, social, and governance goals, to reduce their energy intensity. So whether they like it or not, they have to do it if they want to remain in that supply chain. Second reason is the company may be very small and have a not very stable revenue. And for them, it's very difficult to make those kinds of long-term investments, because they simply don't know whether they're going to be in business. The third thing is, the companies that have been in business longer are more likely to invest in energy efficiency, because they have a long enough history to understand that they do have stable customers and may be in business longer. At the same time, some new companies are much more adaptive to changing processes than older companies that have invested hundreds of thousands of dollars and maybe millions of dollars in their process technology. The fifth thing is energy pricing. As I started off, if your energy pricing is so low, it's not likely that a company will consider the cost of energy within their total cost to be enough for them to consider investment in energy efficient processes or processing technology. Now the next is availability of low-cost technical assistance. In this project, we found many companies willing and interested in investing in energy efficiency, but unable to do so because they could not afford the technical assistance. And second, even if low-cost loans were available through, for example, the IFC, or for the government of Vietnam, through special programs, through commercial banks, those loans did not include any funding for the technical assistance that these companies required. So that while they were willing to make a change, they could not, because they simply could not afford the technical assistance. And the last one, accelerated depreciation. When a company invests heavily in new process technology, they need to be able to depreciate the value of that technology in the profit and loss statement of their business rapidly, not over a 20-year period, but as quickly as possible so that they can recover the costs. So now, finally, conclusion. What we saw in this project is that when you talk to businesses about energy efficiency, especially the processes and process technology, you have balance sheet issues that relate to energy pricing, competitiveness, and profitability. But you also have non-balance sheet issues related primarily to technical assistance and the availability of finance. But you also have substitution issues. As noted in the first slide on this presentation, when energy costs are low, companies tend to use more energy rather than invest in capital goods that would reduce their emissions and increase their energy efficiency. But now, more recently, we see that we have the possibility of investing in rooftop solar and behind-the-meter solar. As John Ruckel mentioned in his first presentation, the Power and Energy Working Group has been working on this issue since probably 2016, so for the past 4 years. And one of the conclusions from the Power and Energy Working Group is that rooftop solar that is grid connected should be raised from 1 to 3 megawatts, so that individual companies, businesses like the one you see here, can provide their own energy when the sun shines and still be able to get energy from EVN when they need it. And we also believe that that behind-the-meter solar, like the kinds of projects that are run through the industrial zones, should be raised to at least 30 megawatts without a utility license, so that IZs can also benefit from the availability of rooftops over a much larger space to provide energy at lower cost for businesses. So that concludes my presentation. My time's up. Thank you very much.